Today we're going to be making Ahsoka's T6 shuttle. I have had one of these on my list to build for so long now. The original was scratch built, which I unfortunately don't have the time to dedicate to at the moment, but printing this file by Big Bang Collectibles should do the trick. Because of all of the fine details in this model, I knew this was going to be a resin print project. I increased the scale of the files to 144% just to make it a bit more impressive, although it's still only about half of the size of the original. The wing pieces I ended up hollowing, not only to save on resin use, but so that the ship didn't end up weighing 30 pounds by the end. Because all of these pieces were very geometric and flat, for the most part I oriented them pretty straight and used Lychee's support projection tool. And how this works is you select a face and then it will project upwards a variety of supports. So you can see me here, I'm adjusting them slightly so you have separate adjustments for the border as well as the infill. So I tend to keep them pretty dense around the outside area, but then I will also go back in beyond this and add heavy supports. In this case, I'm typically using medium strength supports, mostly because the pieces that I'm typically printing aren't particularly small and delicate. Like you can see here, even though these are for a scaled model, they are still quite chunky pieces. If it is a very geometric shape like this, I tend to not use Lychee's magic tool just because it will really over support the piece, and it'll take me less time if I just go in and do this exactly how I want it than delete any excess supports that the program might automatically generate. Once I had all of the pieces supported, I went ahead and exported them to start getting them printed. Elegoo recently sent me over some of their new ABS-like 3.0 resins, and this project seemed like the perfect opportunity to try them out. You have the standard ABS-like, the ABS-like Plus, which is supposed to be even stronger, and the ABS-like 8K, which is specifically designed for retaining all of the fine detail in prints. I started with the standard ABS-like, added some into my Saturn III's vat because there are quite a lot of large pieces for this ship. I had a tiny bit of black resin left in the vat, which is why this first round of prints are going to be a bit of a darker gray. In general, the ABS-like 3.0 is a lot thinner of a resin, which means it's easier to print with. Thinner resins can print a lot faster and can also result in less print failures since they're less temperature sensitive. I ended up using a 2.2 second exposure time per layer and a 25 to 30 seconds for the burn-in layers. I stuck with the standard ABS-like for all of these larger ship pieces on the Saturn III. A lot of them were really pushing the print volume of this machine. I sliced up some of the smaller pieces for my Mars 5 Ultra and decided to try out the 8K resin. Some of the smaller pieces had even more detail, so why not maximize the possible print quality with the resin. Once I managed to get all of the pieces printed, it was then on to cleaning. Nothing extraordinarily exciting to say about this process other than I use a two-step cleaning method. I have like a more dirty vat of alcohol, and then I have the cleaner vat, which is what is actually attached to the machine. So I kind of dunk it in the first one, let that drip out, and then move it over to the second vat, where I typically have it run for 4 minutes. Some of these wing pieces truly barely fit in this machine, and I could not be bothered to add more alcohol in this, so I just turned the pieces around so that both pieces could get cleaned. It is slightly questionable looking, but it worked out perfectly fine. And here is what the cleaned off pieces were looking like. The lines on a couple of them are just from where I added more resin into the vat. It's not actually like an artifact or something, but all of these pieces printed absolutely beautifully. The detail on this model is insane, but all of the surfaces are really super smooth. They're basically paint ready other than the few seams that I'm going to have to deal with where the parts themselves are split up. Yeah, it seems like all of this new resin printed really well, and I managed to get my exposure times down pretty good. But now it is on to support material. A lot of these could easily sort of be flicked off with my fingers, but you know I like using my heat gun to more easily remove all of these supports and leave less of the like tip debris that's like right up against the actual piece. The heat gun's just so easy to use, and it makes the support removal so much easier and cleaner. A lot of the support areas were like on the outside of the pieces, but there were some more finer areas that I had to go in with some tweezers and small pliers just because my fingers were not fitting in there to get these small supports out. It wasn't super applicable since these are quite large chunky pieces, but the heat on the support material means that you are less likely to accidentally damage the piece when removing the supports. Like, it will release itself from the part instead of accidentally pulling that entire, possibly more delicate piece straight off of the print. Once I managed to get all of the support material removed, it was then onto curing these parts. And there of course had to be those same pieces that were interesting to get fitting and standing up on their own in the cure machine. But we managed, it's all good. Now, I really didn't do much post-processing to these parts. It was mostly filing down some of the rougher areas where support material was, and a little sanding where there was more visible voxel lines. And then it was on to assembly. Each wing is in 3 parts, so I started by gluing these 2 halves sort of together because this larger piece goes across those 2 parts. And here's what one wing looks like all put together. And then I just repeated the exact same process for the other side. There are actually dowels to help line up these pieces, which is really convenient. And then the only other single part that needs assembly is the main fuselage. There are obviously more parts to the ship than this, but these are the pieces that have a seam that I am now going to need to work on getting rid of. And to do that, all I did was put some of the ABS-like resin in this fine needle nose tip bottle and squeezed a bit into the gap between parts to gradually fill it up, curing it in between. Because this resin is still like in its fully liquid form, if you tried to fill up the seam with it like to the top, it just wouldn't work. So you want to do like slightly thinner layers of this stuff, curing it in between, and gradually build it up to the top to then hopefully not give yourself too much to sand off, but also make that seam line disappear. But now it is on to my favorite part, painting. Well, priming first. I went with this gray primer. I have a love-hate relationship with this particular primer. It does work really nice, but it is like so prone to clogging your airbrushes. It's just, it builds up, it's really stringy, but it's like a microfiller primer, so it makes everything look absolutely flawless if you've like accidentally missed an area that you should have sanded. So I guess use at your own risk, and I'm apparently still willing to risk it. But I just covered all of the pieces in this primer to start off. And once I let it dry for a few hours, it was time for the base coat of paint. I decided to go with the Tamiya buff color and then thinned it out. It just seemed like the perfect light creamy beige to use as a base. We are going to be going over this quite a few times, but I basically sprayed this everywhere other than on the engines because I knew I was going to be painting those in a metallic color later, but for the most part, everything got sprayed in this beige, even though a lot of it's going to be turned into a different color later. I really wanted to make sure the main body of the ship and wings were covered very well in this, because even the areas that are going to become red later on, we're going to be scratching it off, and I would like the underneath to look like it does in, you know, real life, which is the red is presumably painted over the beige, and so the beige is visible underneath the red. When this base coat dried, it was looking a little dark and a little warm, so I mixed up these lighter gray colors, mixed in some extra water so they weren't as like 100% opacity intense, and essentially just went over all of those exact same areas where I had painted the base coat. Regardless of specific color match, I do find that doing multiple coats of slightly varying colors just gives your pieces a way more interesting look than sticking to that one color and just doing the multiple layers. It just gives it ever so subtly that extra little bit of dimension. This was still looking a little too one-dimensional, so I went in with these couple of darker beigey grays, mixed them together with some water again so they weren't as intense, and this I more strategically sprayed to give it a little bit of dimension and texture, and so that it wasn't just such like a flat color. Listen, painting is the one hill that I'm always going to die on, so whether you personally think these steps make a difference or not, I'm going to be doing them anyway. But now on to what is probably my least favorite part of any given project, the masking stage. I do try and avoid it as much as possible, which you will see, but in this particular case, it was going to be the best course of action to get these very specific red markings onto the wings of this ship. I'm of course staring intently at reference photos while doing all of this, and this also was the second wing that I decided to mask off, so I sort of had already formulated a decent plan, which is why I'm not just like seemingly have no clue what I'm doing in terms of masking stuff. I'd gotten it down to a science at this point. So this one area was interesting. I figured out sort of like the mathematical equation of where these lines should be marked. It ended up looking like it should have been an even third between the distance of 2 points. That there's really just no good way to verbally explain this, so I'm just gonna let you look at what I'm doing. Everything I just tried to figure out like a good reference point of where I could measure and mark things off of to get this looking like it should. Thankfully, the cockpit was pretty straightforward. It was sort of just to follow this one line around the edge where the red needs to be and just cut the excess masking tape. So a nice brain break after giving myself a headache with the fuselage and wings. And once everything had been taped up, it was on to start painting on this red. I really liked the one Vallejo color, but I added a few drops of the brighter scarlet red just because the one color seemed a bit dull and brown, so just really to bring up the saturation of the red a little bit. And I did not end up doing a pre-coat of like the matching color to try and stop any bleeding. There was so much paneling detail on these parts that it just really was not going to do much, so instead I just did my best to sort of spray my airbrush in the direction away from the tape. Like I didn't spray it into the edge of the tape, I sprayed away, and for the most part that worked out perfectly fine. There was a little bit of feathering in some of those deeper panel recesses where the tape just wasn't stuck down as much. Like honestly, there was probably almost no way of getting the tape in some of those small crevices. And by the end of this painting, those masking lines are not going to be as sharp. Like there's weathering, we're going to deal with it, it's not going to be very visible. But for the most part, these parts turned out really clean. The masking did work, so I was happy that there wasn't some catastrophe that I was going to be unveiling underneath all of this tape. Now, the red area on this fuselage can look a bit crazy and messy in some places, and that is because we have a whole lot of metallic to now add. So I did start out by masking once again, which apparently I filmed none of, probably because I was just sick of sticking tape on for hours onto these parts. But to give myself a good base for the metallic, I used some glossy black primer and painted any of the parts that I was going to then add the metallic paint to. I went with a slightly darker silver this time around. Metallic shades can be a pretty hard thing to gauge just because they can be so reflective and change so much in different lighting, but it did not seem to be a particularly bright silver. And once that is all dried, I could go ahead and start removing all of this tape. Thankfully, this once again was a very successful masking job by some miracle. I'm not sure where my luck is coming from because normally there's always at least one area that it ends up being a mess, but this was looking really nice. But outside of the main areas on the fuselage that needed to be metallic, there were some other areas that I just could not be bothered to mask off, so paintbrush it is. I used the exact same paints that I airbrushed with, just with a brush this time. The primer is a little watery, but a lot of these areas were almost like going to be dry brushed anyway, and I can always do 2 coats. It really was not a big deal, and it was way more convenient to just do this by hand than try and mask some of these areas off. For this back section on the wing, it did appear to be much more of a brighter metallic, so I just decided to go in straight with the metallic on top of the pre-existing paint and not add the glossy black base. But I did decide to go in with a brighter metallic silver onto this wing strip, I'm gonna call it. This was a raised detail, so it was really easy to paint as long as you hold your brush at the right angle to sort of skim across it. But now onto a bit more of an experimental paint aspect of this project. I wanted to try adding some heat tint to the engines. On the actual model, they apparently used metallic alcohol ink, which I was going to use and then proceeded to just completely forget to buy some. But metallic and pearlescent alcohol ink tends to just have mica powder mixed in, and I figured the combination of this sapphire metallic paint and also the color shift paint would emulate that sort of duochrome and color shifting properties it has. And that was it for the sort of base paint for this ship, and now it's on to weathering. I started off with using using this metal sponge and very carefully started to scratch and chip away at some of the paint, especially around the red areas, to start bringing out that paint chipping effect and giving the paneling details a little more dimension and depth. You can see from pictures of this model that this is not supposed to look like a brand new ship. In fact, they mention many times just how old this ship actually is, so even if they have repainted it, it still shows some wear and tear. I went in with a very fine point brush and some of that light beige color to bring out some of those panel lines a little better. I was worried that I was going to scuff up the surface a bit too much, and this was just the more precise way of adding in some of those scratches. I then grabbed my airbrush with like a really dark gray wash, pretty thinned out, to add some more of that blaster burning and scorching look to certain areas. To give some areas a bit more depth, I did really overspray it and then added some more water over top and blotted that off with a paper towel. But for the most part, I was using my airbrush and this mixture to add pretty particular dark spots into certain areas, because you could see in all of the reference photos that the surface of the ship is definitely not like 100% clean, so adding in those darker spots just really helped tell the story that this ship has been through it over the years. I then went in with some actual black wash, specifically onto the metallic areas. The metallic paint just doesn't take the weathering the same way that the non-metallic sections do, and I could also end up going a lot darker in these sections without worrying that it was too much weathering. You know, I really didn't want to overdo the darkness, especially on the beige parts of this ship, and just going in with a brush was a lot easier for these metallic areas. But we're not stopping with the weathering there. I decided to pull out some panel line, which I'm not actually sure if I've had the opportunity to use on a project yet. I have had some in my workshop for a while because this stuff is so cool. I've tried to do a close-up here of how this stuff works, but essentially you just tap it along the areas, generally panel lines, where you want to add some depth and darkness, and it will just spread out on its own. So you can see I'm just tapping in various locations and it starts to spread itself out along the panels, and it's just so easy to use. It gives an absolutely incredible effect, and this dark gray color in particular worked great on this ship. It wasn't too dark, so it gave the effect of it being more grime as opposed to like extreme dirt, which, you know, you would think really wouldn't be on this ship given that it's traveling through space most of the time, and there's no other parts on the ship that give the impression that it's dirty in any of that sort of way. It really just gave it a nice subtle touch where it was bringing out that paneling detail more without it being super obvious. And with that, I was calling this paint job finished, which meant I could go ahead and assemble the final pieces together. It was mainly gluing the wings onto this central pivot piece. But now we have to talk about an issue of my own making. I printed the cockpit canopy glass in some translucent resin, sprayed it with a gloss varnish, and it turned out pretty clear, which is great, except that this model doesn't normally have anything within the cockpit because normally you wouldn't be able to see if it did or not. So I concocted this cockpit insert. This is a combination of like 4 different models from different people scaled down into this ridiculously small size. Then I had to try and paint. Honestly, this was not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but this has to be some sort of record for smallest Huyang ever. It is pretty impressive just given the sheer small scale of this thing and the fact that you can, for the most part, make out all of the different details. I did also end up having to edit the canopy glass because if I didn't, I wouldn't have had any way of actually putting that insert piece into it. Even though the printed glass piece wasn't 100% perfect of a surface finish, you can still very easily make out Huyang and a lot of the internal cockpit details. Next, I mounted the fuselage onto the stand, which I did off camera because it was nerve-wracking and I had to make some hardware adjustments because of scaling the files up. But since it was bolted into place, I could then go ahead and add the final details to this model. First were these inserts to hide the bolts for the stand. I saved painting the red onto them until they were inserted, just so that I could make sure everything was lined up correctly. Next was adding the 4th engine and the ball turret. I specifically waited to add this until it was mounted because I figured I would break those guns right off. And so of course I waited to add the other guns onto this ship until the end as well. I only needed 4 of these, but I printed extras because again, I figured I would break one. And of course, the last thing that this ship was missing was the cockpit, which I added onto the front. And here is the final T6 Jedi Shuttle.